Tonight we're going to talk about the medieval world, that magnificent stew of half-baked ideas, panicked improvisations, and impulsive decisions that somehow congealed into what we now politely call European civilization. It was a place where nothing was really planned, but everything eventually became sacred, where a rushed solution invented on a Tuesday could still be shaping people's lives 600 years later, where just for now was the single most dangerous phrase a medieval mind could utter. So before we tuck into tonight's slow drifting journey through the strange survivals of the medieval world, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here in these late hours. And do let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what time the clock has drifted to on your side of the world. It is always a small delight to imagine all of you tucked into your beds, your armchairs, or your quiet corners, joining me from every distant time zone. So now dim the lights, pull the blanket a little higher, maybe let the soft hum of a fan wash gently over the room, and let us ease together into the sleepy, slightly ridiculous, and endlessly comforting oddities of the medieval world. The medieval curfew bell was never intended to shape the daily rhythm of European life. It began, as so many medieval traditions did, with a very small and specific worry. Fire terrified medieval towns the way modern people fear Wi-Fi outages, only with significantly more justification. Medieval homes were built from timber, thatched with straw, packed together like nervous sheep, and heated by open flames tended by exhausted humans who had already worked 14 hours in the field, and were now, understandably, drifting off to sleep with a candle still burning. One drowsy yawn, one tipped tallow, one poorly stacked log, and an entire neighbourhood could be gone by breakfast. So towns invented a quick, temporary, delightfully practical solution. A bell would ring at a fixed hour in the evening, and every household would be required to cover their fires. In Old French, this was the couvre-feu, literally the cover the fire. From this humble bell would eventually crawl, blinking and confused, the modern word curfew. Now the original idea was simple. Ring the bell, cover the flames, prevent the town from becoming an unexpected bonfire, and everyone could sleep peacefully. Nobody imagined this bell would still be governing behaviour long after it had lost its original purpose. Nobody imagined it would evolve into a legal instrument, a moral instrument, a parental instrument, and eventually a source of teenage suffering across many centuries. It was just a bell. A helpful, temporary, fire-suppressing bell. But medieval Europe, as we have learned, could not be trusted with anything temporary. The moment the bell proved useful, local authorities began wondering what else it could do. If everyone was already covering their fires when it rang, why not require them to close their shutters too? And if their shutters were closed, why not require them to stay inside? And if they were inside, why not simply forbid anyone from wandering the streets after the bell tolled, since honest people had no business outdoors at that hour anyway? And thus a fire safety measure quietly grew into a full-blown behaviour code, complete with fines, punishments, and the deep suspicion of anyone caught outside past sundown. The bell had gone from protecting the town to interrogating it. Watchmen were assigned to patrol the streets after the bell rang, which added yet another layer of medieval improvisation to the whole system. These watchmen, often chosen because they were awake, sober, or at least both of those things on the same evening, roamed the darkened alleys with lanterns and staves, poking into corners and shouting things like, "The curfew has rung." "Get thee home, wretch," which is medieval for "please stop existing outdoors, sir," it distresses the authorities. Anyone found wandering was assumed to be up to no good, since the only people who ventured out after dark were thieves, drunks, spies, poets, and men who had lost significant arguments with their wives. Over time, the curfew bell became so embedded in medieval life that entire towns organised their days around it. Merchants closed their stalls before the bell rang. Taverns tried, without success, to shuffle their most stubborn patrons out the door in time. Mothers used the bell to threaten their children. You had best be home before the curfew, or you shall sleep in the goat pen. Farmers used it to mark the end of their labour. Even monasteries, which already had more bells than humans, adopted secular curfews to align themselves with civic routines. The bell had quietly rewritten the medieval clock. And what began as a fire prevention measure gradually became something almost mystical. Chronicles from the period describe the ringing of the curfew as a sound that separated the safe world from the dangerous one, the ordered day from the shadowy night, the honest citizen from the suspicious stranger. It stopped being about fire entirely. Houses could be made of stone, fires could be safely banked. The physical danger the curfew had been invented to prevent could fade away. And yet the bell kept ringing anyway, because tradition, in medieval Europe, always outlived logic. If a bell had been ringing for 200 years, no one was brave enough to be the person who suggested it stop. By the late medieval period, curfew bells rang in cities that no longer worried about wooden houses collapsing into flames. They rang in towns that had modern fire watches and stone construction. They rang in places where nobody could remember what a couvre-feu even was, only that the bell rang, and when it rang, one closed the door. The temporary fire law had transformed into an emotional heirloom, a comforting rhythm of civic life, a sound mark of the ending day. And centuries later, long after the bells fell silent and the medieval world dissolved into modern nations, the concept of curfew remained. Parents impose it on teenagers, governments impose it during emergencies, cities impose it during unrest. Every time a modern authority tells someone, you must be inside by 10, they are, whether they realise it or not, echoing a medieval fire safety idea that was only supposed to last until better construction methods came along. The bell has stopped, but its shadow keeps ringing. While towns were busy inventing bells they could not stop ringing, medieval villagers were busy inventing another accidentally eternal institution. The village well. Now in the beginning, the village well was almost embarrassingly practical. Someone would notice that everyone was walking too far to fetch water from the river, or that the river had developed a suspicious colour, or that the local monk had suggested rather firmly that drinking from it was making people see angels. So the community gathered together, chose a slightly damp patch of ground, and dug. That was the whole plan. Dig a hole, find water, celebrate, and never think about it again. The well was meant to be temporary in the loosest sense of the word. If it dried up, the village would dig another. If it collapsed, they would move it. If it became contaminated, they would abandon it. There was no expectation that this particular hole would outlive kings, dynasties, and entire architectural eras. And yet the moment a well was dug and proven reliable, it developed an almost magnetic gravitational pull on the community. Houses began to cluster around it. Paths formed leading to it. Gossip accumulated near it, because in medieval villages, the well was where all information travelled fastest, since fetching water was a communal chore, and communal chores are the natural habitat of rumour. Soon the well was no longer just a source of water. It was the social heart of the village. Marriages were arranged near it. Feuds were sparked at it. Deals were made, dissolved, and celebrated within earshot of its stones. Children played around it, sometimes tragically fell into it, and were then very carefully retrieved with ropes and prayers. The village well became the medieval equivalent of the office coffee machine, only with a much higher drowning risk. And once it had become the centre of the community, the well could no longer be moved. To move the well would be to move the village itself, which no medieval peasant had the energy for after a season of harvest. So villagers froze in place around whatever accidental water source their ancestors had discovered while poking at the ground with a stick. Entire settlements grew, expanded, and eventually became towns and cities, all shaped around a hole that was originally supposed to be a short-term convenience. And centuries later, tourists would wander into these old European towns, marvel at the picturesque well in the town square, and never realize they were standing at the accidental cornerstone of an entire community. The medieval guild began, believe it or not, as a very casual affair. A handful of craftsmen in a town, tired of being cheated by outsiders, undercut by amateurs, or bullied by nobles who had never held a hammer in their lives, would gather in a tavern one evening and agree to look out for one another. That was it. That was the plan. A few bakers, or a few blacksmiths, or a few weavers would clink their tankards together and say, "Brothers, from this day forward, we shall not undercut each other's prices, we shall not steal each other's customers, and we shall absolutely not tell the tax collector how much we actually earn." A gentleman's agreement. Temporary, informal, and mostly held together by shared grievances and stronger ale. But medieval Europe, ever the enthusiastic collector of accidental institutions, could not leave a good idea alone. Within a generation, the friendly tavern agreement had grown a rulebook. Within 2 generations, it had grown officers. Within 3, it had grown a coat of arms, a private chapel, a hall of its own, and enough legal authority to fine, exile, or humiliate anyone who dared bake a loaf without permission. The temporary craftsman's brotherhood had, without anyone quite noticing, transformed into one of the most powerful economic institutions of medieval Europe, and the young apprentice who wandered into a guild hoping to learn a trade quickly discovered that he had also joined a family, a court, a lodge, a charity, an army, and possibly a small religion, all at once. Guilds began to regulate everything, not just prices, not just quality, but the entire shape of a craftsman's life. How long he had to serve as an apprentice, how much he could charge, what tools he could own, whom he could marry, how many candles he could burn in his shop, whether he was allowed to work on Sundays, saints' days, half-saints' days, saints' cousins' days, or the day the local bishop had a mild headache and decided to declare a rest. Guilds even regulated how many customers a craftsman could serve on any given day, for fear of one member becoming too prosperous and making everyone else look lazy by comparison. It was medieval capitalism politely wearing the mask of medieval brotherhood, and everyone agreed to pretend they could not see the seams. And yet, for all their bureaucracy, guilds also provided real comfort in a genuinely uncertain world. If a member fell ill, the guild helped feed his family. If a member died, the guild paid for his burial and cared for his widow. If a member's workshop burned down, the guild rebuilt it, muttering all the while about how it definitely was not liable, but also secretly proud of its own generosity. What had begun as a tavern's worth of grumbling craftsmen had become a genuine safety net, centuries before anyone would use that phrase, and so guilds endured. Some lasted for 600 years or more, outliving kingdoms, plagues, revolutions, and the entire concept of the medieval world itself. The Temporary Tavern Alliance had in the end outlived nearly everything that had ever tried to replace it. Medieval fairs were another one of those charming temporary events that quietly refused to end. In the beginning, a fair was a simple idea. Twice a year, or perhaps 4 times if the region was ambitious, a town would clear a large field, invite merchants from far away, and host a great gathering where people could buy things they could not normally find. Spices from the east, cloth from the north, livestock from the south, rumours from everywhere. A fair was not meant to be a permanent fixture. It was a special occasion, a rare treat, a reason to put on your less filthy tunic and walk to town with a hopeful expression and an empty coin purse. But the moment a fair proved successful, medieval logic took over. If people would come from 3 counties away for a single week of trade, could they be persuaded to come for 2 weeks? Could a second fair be held later in the year? Could a third fair be added to celebrate a saint whose specialty was, conveniently, whatever the town wanted to sell? By the late medieval period, some regions had fairs so frequent, so overlapping, and so aggressively expanded that the calendar simply gave up and merged them together into what was, functionally, one endless year-long fair, with a few polite intermissions. The great fairs of Champagne in France became legendary for this. What began as small local trading events grew into international meccas, where merchants from Italy, Flanders, Germany, Spain, and even further afield gathered to exchange goods, currencies, and complaints. A visitor could stumble into a Champagne fair, expecting to buy some wool and leave, 3 weeks later, having accidentally invested in a Genoese banking scheme, adopted a Flemish accent, and married someone from Toulouse. The temporary market had become a permanent economic ecosystem, and when the fairs eventually declined, they did not really vanish. They simply migrated indoors and became something we now know as banking, which is quite possibly the most medieval outcome imaginable. Then there is the strange story of the medieval bridge. Now, bridges in medieval Europe were often initially constructed as urgent solutions to a very specific problem. A river was in the way. Someone needed to cross it. A local lord or an ambitious abbot would announce, "We shall build a bridge here," temporarily of course, until we can build a proper stone one later. And then, as usual, later never came. The temporary wooden bridge stayed. It creaked. It sagged. It occasionally collapsed with dramatic timing during weddings or royal processions. And still, it was patched, repaired, reinforced, and stubbornly kept in service. Because tearing it down would mean the town had no bridge at all, and that was a fate worse than falling into the river. Eventually, when the wooden bridge had rotted beyond even medieval standards of acceptable danger, a stone bridge was finally constructed on the same spot. And once that stone bridge was built, it acquired the unexpected medieval habit of collecting buildings. Because the bridge was already there, and because rents inside city walls were extortionate, enterprising merchants began renting the space directly on top of the bridge itself. They built shops. They built homes. They built entire multi-story structures that leaned precariously over the water below, held up by faith, timber beams, and the polite refusal of physics to intervene. Some medieval bridges became, in effect, floating neighbourhoods. The Old London Bridge famously carried dozens of buildings on its back, along with a chapel, several taverns, and the occasional impaled traitor's head mounted on a spike, because medieval urban planning was nothing if not comprehensive in its aesthetic choices. Nobody had planned for bridges to become neighbourhoods. Nobody had planned for temporary crossings to become permanent addresses. And nobody had planned for the poor souls living on top of them to spend their entire lives being gently rocked by the vibrations of every cart that thundered across. But once people were living there, once shops were open, once children had been born in bedrooms that swayed slightly over the river, no one could quite bring themselves to tear it down. A temporary river crossing had become a permanent piece of city life. And in some places, this arrangement lasted for centuries, until modern engineers finally arrived, looked at the whole situation, and gently suggested that perhaps it was time to stop stacking houses on bridges. The medieval market day was yet another temporary institution that quietly refused to leave. In the very early medieval period, markets were held whenever they were needed. If a village had extra grain, someone would organise a small gathering. If a passing merchant brought interesting goods, a spontaneous market might materialise by mid-afternoon. It was informal, flexible, and entirely responsive to local needs. But then someone, probably a bishop who was tired of everyone showing up at random hours, made the fateful suggestion. Let us hold the market only on certain days, perhaps Wednesdays. It shall be temporary, of course, until we find a better rhythm. Naturally, the temporary market day became eternal, and once a village had a designated market day, it had a designated identity. Villagers became known by their market days. Ah yes, they are the Tuesday market folk, notoriously overcharged for onions. Neighbouring villages coordinated their market days so as not to overlap, forming a rotating regional trading system in which a determined merchant could travel from town to town all week and never miss an opportunity to argue about the price of turnips. The days themselves became sacred. Try suggesting to a medieval village that the Wednesday market be moved to Thursday, and you would be met with the kind of horror usually reserved for heresy trials. Some market days became so entrenched that they still exist today, in the exact same towns, on the exact same weekday, in the exact same square, nearly 1,000 years later. A tourist wandering through a European village might innocently ask why the market is held on Thursdays, And the honest answer is that a medieval lord in the 12th century made an offhand decision, and nobody has felt confident enough to change it since. The temporary schedule became the permanent schedule, became the eternal schedule. And somewhere, in the great archive of medieval improvisations, a scribe is undoubtedly smiling. The medieval oath was originally a very small, informal thing. If two men wanted to agree on something, whether a business arrangement, a boundary dispute, or the return of a borrowed goat, they would simply place their hands on some suitably serious object and swear to keep their word. That serious object could be a Bible, a relic, a saint's finger bone, a piece of the true cross, or in more rural areas, a particularly impressive rock that everyone had agreed carried spiritual weight. The oath was meant to be temporary, a one-time confirmation, a brief ceremony to seal a specific promise. Once the goat was returned or the boundary respected, the oath was considered fulfilled and life went on. But medieval Europe, ever unable to leave a good ritual alone, discovered that oaths were terribly useful. And once they were terribly useful, they multiplied with the enthusiasm of rabbits in springtime. Soon oaths were required for everything. Marriages required oaths. Loyalty to a lord required oaths. Joining a guild required oaths. Buying property required oaths. Being appointed to a village office required oaths. Testifying in court required oaths, plural, layered on top of one another until the poor witness was swearing on so many holy objects that the room began to feel like a religious jumble sale. Some medieval trials required a defendant to gather a certain number of oath helpers, neighbours and friends who would swear alongside him that he was a good and honest man, and if he could not find enough people to vouch for him, he was assumed guilty by default. Justice in this arrangement was less about evidence and more about popularity, and what began as a simple gesture of sincerity gradually became a bureaucratic obligation. Kings demanded oaths from their nobles. Nobles demanded oaths from their knights. Knights demanded oaths from their retainers. Retainers demanded oaths from their servants. Servants, presumably, demanded oaths from their chickens. Each rung of medieval society was bound together by a rope of interlocking promises, and the rope, though invisible, was pulled remarkably tight. If you broke an oath, you broke your soul, your reputation, your inheritance, and quite possibly your neck. A man who broke oaths casually was considered lower than a thief, since a thief only stole objects, but an oath-breaker stole trust. The strangest part is that oaths never really disappeared. They evolved. They shed their saints and their relics. They dropped the drama of holy fingers and true crosses. But every time a modern person raises their right hand in a courtroom, or signs a contract with a solemn expression, or swears an oath of office at an inauguration, they are performing a distant, tidied-up descendant of a medieval ritual that was only supposed to secure the return of a borrowed goat. The temporary handclasp became the permanent handshake, became the permanent signature, became the permanent legal system. And somewhere, a medieval peasant is very quietly amused. The medieval inn began, quite touchingly, as an act of hospitality. In the early medieval period, travellers were rare, roads were dangerous, and the idea of sleeping outdoors after dark filled most sensible people with the sort of dread usually reserved for approaching wolves. So monasteries and generous households would offer weary strangers a bed for the night, a warm meal, and a cautious blessing before sending them on their way at dawn. This was meant to be an occasional kindness, extended only when needed, and never intended to become a permanent economic sector. But once travellers realised they could count on shelter, more of them began travelling. And once more of them began travelling, hospitality became a small industry. And once it became a small industry, it stopped being hospitality altogether and became business, complete with prices, receipts, and mildly resentful innkeepers who had once believed they were performing charity. Inns began appearing along popular roads, spaced at just the right intervals to catch travellers as their feet began to ache. They were usually simple affairs at first. A large room, a fire, a communal bed shared by strangers who had every right to fear each other. Nobody had privacy. Nobody had personal space. And nobody, absolutely nobody, had any reasonable expectation of getting a full night's sleep, because medieval communal beds tended to contain snorers, criers, sleep talkers, and at least one man who insisted on wearing his boots. The idea of a private room was so exotic that when it finally arrived centuries later, it was considered a nearly royal luxury. Modern travellers who complain about a bad hotel room have no idea what depths of nocturnal suffering their ancestors survived. Yet the inn, despite its many indignities, became a permanent fixture of medieval life. Once innkeepers realised that they could reliably profit from tired strangers, they refused to give up the trade. Their inns passed from parent to child, from generation to generation, some of them still standing today with the same names, the same wooden beams, and the same suspiciously creaking staircases they had 800 years ago. A traveller wandering into an old European inn tonight may well be sleeping in a building that first welcomed weary pilgrims when the Norman conquest was still recent news. The temporary act of kindness had become an entire industry, and the industry, unlike the pilgrims it once sheltered, never packed up and moved on. The medieval calendar itself was a kind of ongoing temporary experiment that everyone forgot to finalise. In the beginning, Europe used the old Roman calendar, which had been polite and orderly and slightly off from the actual solar year. The Roman calendar had been intended as a good enough system until something better came along. Something better did not come along for a very, very long time. So medieval Europe simply carried on with the Roman calendar, gradually drifting further and further away from the actual seasons, until, by the late medieval period, the calendar was so out of sync with reality that Easter kept sliding around the year like a puppy on a polished floor. Nobody could quite agree on how to fix this. Every century or so, an ambitious scholar would emerge, wave a chart around, and announce that the calendar was catastrophically wrong and must be reformed immediately. And every century or so, the calendar would remain exactly as it was, because reforming it would require kings, bishops, and merchants to agree on something, and getting medieval kings. Bishops and merchants to agree on anything was harder than getting a cat to accept a bath. So the calendar continued its slow drift, and the seasons continued to mock it, and everyone politely pretended that spring festivals in the middle of winter were completely normal. It would take until 1582 for the Gregorian calendar to finally arrive and gently correct the mess, though even then some regions refused to adopt it for another 200 years, because tradition, as we have learned, is the strongest force in medieval history and its afterlife alike. The medieval clock, when it finally arrived, was intended to help with this very problem. Early mechanical clocks were installed in monasteries as temporary devices to keep the monks on schedule for their prayers. Monks prayed at very specific hours, 7 of them each day, and each one had to be timed carefully. Sundials worked when the sun cooperated, and water clocks worked when the water did not freeze, but neither system was reliable enough for a monastery that took its schedule seriously. So the mechanical clock was invented as a small helpful device, tucked into a tower, chiming out the hours so that the monks could stumble bleary-eyed to their prayers on time. Once the clock existed, however, it refused to remain confined to monasteries. Townspeople heard the chimes from the abbey tower, and they liked the idea of a shared time. Soon towns commissioned their own clocks, mounted on their own towers, chiming out over marketplaces and streets. And the moment a town had a public clock, the town's rhythm began to shift. People no longer worked from sunrise to sunset. They worked from the ringing of one hour to the ringing of another. Employers began paying by the hour instead of by the day. Merchants opened their stalls at exact times. Meetings were scheduled to the quarter hour. And human beings, who had for thousands of years lived by the loose pace of the sun and the seasons, began, for the first time in history, to live by numbers. The medieval clock was never intended to change the fundamental nature of human life. It was supposed to help monks remember their prayers. And yet, from those humble monastery bells came the entire concept of scheduled time, of punctuality, of being late, of running on the clock. Every modern office worker glancing anxiously at their watch, every commuter checking the time on their phone, every parent muttering that they are running 15 minutes behind, is unknowingly participating in a medieval accident. A device meant to help a few dozen men pray at the right hour became the invisible skeleton of modern civilization. Time itself, as we experience it, was quietly reshaped by a temporary monastic convenience. The medieval charter was another of these accidental permanents. In the early medieval period, a lord who founded a new town would issue a charter, a written document granting the town certain rights, freedoms, and privileges. This was often done as a temporary inducement to attract settlers. The lord needed people to move to his new town, to farm his land, to pay his taxes, and to make his territory prosperous. So he offered generous terms in the charter, promising freedoms that no medieval peasant living under a more established lord could dream of. Reduced taxes, freedom from certain obligations, the right to hold markets, the right to elect local officials. The lord fully intended to revoke or renegotiate these terms once the town was well established and no longer needed the incentive. Except the town never let him. Once a charter was granted, the townspeople guarded it with a ferocity that would have impressed dragons. They locked the original document in a chest, sometimes in the town hall, sometimes in a church, and they produced it triumphantly whenever any lord, king, or bishop attempted to modify their rights. A charter was not a suggestion. A charter was a contract with eternity, and medieval townspeople understood, better than their lords ever did, that a piece of parchment with wax seals could outlast dynasties. The charter, once secured, became the town's sacred heirloom. Generations passed. Lords died. Kings changed. Whole ruling houses collapsed into obscurity, and yet the charter remained, brittle and yellowed, tucked into its little wooden chest, ready to be waved at any authority who dared to question the town's ancient privileges. Some towns held on to their charters for 6, 7, even 800 years, occasionally producing them in modern courtrooms to defend rights that no living person could quite remember requesting. A temporary inducement to attract settlers had become the constitutional foundation of entire communities. The lords who signed those charters never imagined that a promise made on a Thursday afternoon in the 12th century would still be legally binding a millennium later. But medieval Europe, as always, treated ink as if it were carved into stone, and stone as if it were carved into the sky. The medieval tournament, too, began as something rather more temporary than the grand pageant it eventually became. In the early days, tournaments were simply organised training exercises for knights. Warfare was expensive, wars were unpredictable, and knights needed to keep their skills sharp during peacetime lest they grow soft, bored, or worse, financially cautious. So local lords would host informal gatherings where knights could joust, wrestle, and generally pretend to kill one another in a controlled environment. The idea was practical, brief, and blessedly free of ceremony. Knights showed up, hit each other with sticks, bled decoratively, and went home. But nothing in the medieval world was allowed to remain simple, and tournaments were no exception. Within a generation or two, they had acquired heralds, judges, banners, elaborate dress codes, complicated rules, and audiences of noblewomen who came primarily to admire the participants and secondarily to enjoy the light entertainment of watching them get concussed. Tournaments became social events, then political events, then economic events. Merchants set up stalls. Innkeepers raised their prices. Priests grumbled about the immorality of it all, and then attended anyway to see whether their favourite knight would win. Entire towns transformed themselves into festival grounds whenever a tournament was announced, and knights travelled hundreds of miles to participate, dragging squires, servants, horses, tents, and enough armour to sink a small ship. The prize money grew. The prestige grew. The costumes grew, and kept growing, until knights were riding into the lists wearing helmets shaped like animals, dragons, birds of prey, and, in at least one recorded case, a very confused-looking fish. The temporary training exercise had become a full-blown industry, complete with celebrity athletes, sponsorships from wealthy patrons, and the medieval equivalent of tabloid gossip. Chronicles from the period gleefully reported which knight had unhorsed which lord, which duke had disgraced himself by falling off his own horse before the joust even began, and which noblewoman had thrown her favour to a knight who was, awkwardly, not her husband. Kings occasionally tried to ban tournaments. They cited the dangers, the deaths, the injuries, the disruption to public order, and the alarming number of noblemen who kept getting themselves killed before they could produce heirs. And every time a king banned tournaments, the tournaments simply moved to another kingdom, or continued in slightly disguised form, or resumed after the king lost interest, or resumed after the king died, which in medieval Europe happened with surprising frequency. What began as a way to keep knights fit had become a permanent fixture of noble culture, one that outlived the practical need for it by centuries. Even after gunpowder had made the armoured knight essentially obsolete, tournaments continued as ceremonial spectacles, because tradition, once again, cheerfully refused to acknowledge that its original purpose had long since evaporated. The medieval pilgrimage was another temporary journey that turned into a permanent institution. In its earliest form, a pilgrimage was a rare and deeply personal act. A devout Christian might, once in their lifetime, undertake a long and difficult journey to a holy site, either to seek forgiveness for a serious sin, to fulfill a solemn vow, or to be cured of an illness that ordinary prayers had failed to address. It was meant to be extraordinary. A single voyage of spiritual significance, remembered forever after. Once it was done, it was done. One did not simply become a professional pilgrim. Except, of course, that is exactly what many medieval people became. Once pilgrimage sites like Rome, Santiago de Compostela, and Jerusalem became widely known, and once the roads leading to them became relatively safer, ordinary people began undertaking pilgrimages for less extraordinary reasons. Some went for adventure. Some went because their neighbour had gone and boasted about it insufferably. Some went to escape their spouses. Some went because a local priest had rather bluntly suggested that their soul was in urgent need of geographical assistance. Whole industries sprang up around pilgrimage routes. Inns, hospices, chapels, souvenir sellers, guides, protectors, forgers of holy relics, and enterprising con artists who could sell you a splinter of the true cross for a very reasonable price. If every fragment of the true cross that was sold across medieval Europe had been genuine, the original cross would have been the size of a small forest. Pilgrimage badges became fashionable. Travellers would buy small metal tokens at each holy site they visited and pin them to their cloaks like medieval passport stamps, proudly announcing, "I have been to Canterbury," or "I have been to Rome," or "I have been to Santiago, and my feet shall never forgive me." Some particularly ambitious pilgrims wore so many badges that they clanked when they walked, which added a strange metallic accompaniment to their spiritual journeys. What had begun as a rare, once-in-a-lifetime act of devotion had become, in some cases, a lifelong hobby. And the roads to these holy sites, which nobody had ever formally planned, became the great highways of medieval Europe, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps that were only ever supposed to walk them once. The medieval sumptuary law was one of the more entertaining temporary measures that quietly refused to expire. These were laws that regulated what people could wear, what colours they could dye their clothes, what fabrics they could afford, what jewellery they could display, and even, in some regions, how pointy the toes of their shoes were allowed to be. Yes, the pointiness of shoes. Medieval Europe had strong opinions about pointy shoes. In the 14th century, aristocratic men began wearing shoes with points so absurdly long that they had to be tied to the wearer's knees with chains to prevent tripping. Sumptuary laws were introduced to limit these shoes, specifying by rank exactly how many inches of point a man was permitted to display. Peasants got 2 inches, merchants got 6, knights got 12, great nobles got 24. It was a legal system in which one's social standing could be measured, quite literally, by the length of one's toes. These laws were supposed to be temporary. They were introduced to address specific fashion excesses, or to stop merchants from dressing like nobles, or to prevent commoners from wearing colours that were considered the exclusive property of the aristocracy. Purple, in particular, was fiercely protected. Wearing the wrong shade of purple could earn a commoner a fine, a public shaming, or the loss of the offending garment. And yet these fashion regulations, meant to correct passing trends, stayed on the books for centuries. Some sumptuary laws remained legally enforceable long after the fashions they targeted had died out. A law forbidding a certain style of gown could still be technically valid 200 years after anyone had actually worn such a gown. Medieval legal cleanup was, as always, a task nobody wanted to volunteer for. The medieval fair court, sometimes called a pie-powder court, was another temporary invention that quietly outlasted its original need. When fairs became major commercial events, disputes inevitably arose. A merchant might accuse another of cheating with weights. A customer might complain about spoiled goods. A visitor might be pickpocketed on his way to the ale tent. The regular courts of the region could not possibly handle these disputes efficiently, since a merchant from Genoa was not going to wait around for 3 months in a foreign town while local officials scheduled a hearing. So temporary courts were established at fairs, specifically to resolve disputes quickly, informally, and with a level of speed that regular medieval justice could only dream of. The name pie powder came from the French pieds poudreux, meaning dusty feet, a poetic reference to the travelling merchants whose feet were always dusty from the roads. These courts were meant to exist only for the duration of the fair. Once the fair ended, the court dissolved. Once the merchants moved on, so did the justice. It was medieval improvisation at its most elegant, except of course that pie-powder courts became so useful that they refused to end. Even when a fair had shrunk to a mere shadow of its former self, or when the fair had been rescheduled, moved or absorbed into a larger urban market, the pie-powder court quietly continued to operate. In some English towns, pie-powder courts were technically still functioning until the 20th century, hearing occasional cases about market disputes centuries after anyone with actual dusty feet had wandered through. A temporary emergency tribunal had become an institution older than most modern countries. And then there is the medieval fence, the humble temporary fence, which was originally just a way for a farmer to keep his sheep from eating a neighbour's beans. Fences began as informal boundaries, thrown together with whatever materials were at hand. Sticks, thorn bushes, piled stones, occasional wooden planks stolen from someone else's fence. Nobody expected these boundaries to be permanent. They shifted with the seasons, with the harvests, with the changing whims of neighbours who occasionally rearranged them in the middle of the night when nobody was watching. Medieval property boundaries were notoriously flexible, and disputes about them fill more parchment than almost any other topic in medieval legal records. But once a fence had stood for a while, medieval law began to treat it as if it had always been there. If a fence had marked the boundary between 2 fields for a generation, then that fence was the boundary, whether it had been placed correctly or not. If someone tried to move it, the community would insist it be moved back, not because they knew where the true boundary was, but because they had all agreed to pretend the current boundary was correct. And these accidental, temporary thorn and stone fences ended up defining the shape of European farmland for the next 1,000 years. Modern land surveyors, when they finally arrived with their instruments and their maps, discovered field boundaries that made no geometric sense whatsoever, boundaries that zigzagged and curved and doubled back on themselves. These strange, zigzagging field boundaries, drawn in mud and thorns by peasants who had no interest in cartographic elegance, were quietly canonized into the geography of Europe forever. When railways were later built across the countryside, they had to curve awkwardly around fields whose shapes had been decided by a medieval argument about a wandering pig. When highways came, they too bent themselves around ancient property lines. And when satellite images finally revealed the landscape of Europe from above, generations of geographers stared at their screens in polite bewilderment, unable to explain why entire regions were divided into shapes that resembled the doodles of a distracted child. The answer, of course, was that a temporary fence in the year 1140 had been declared permanent by a village elder who had never expected anyone to look at his handiwork from space. Medieval improvisation had once again outlived the very concept of medieval Europe itself. The medieval scribe began as a temporary solution to a very inconvenient truth. Almost nobody could write. This was a problem, because kings needed to issue decrees, bishops needed to record ordinations, merchants needed to keep accounts, and lords needed to document exactly how much rent their tenants owed, since medieval memory had a curious habit of shrinking whenever payment was due. So monasteries, which happened to contain the greatest concentration of literate humans in medieval Europe, offered a temporary service. If a nobleman needed something written, he could bring it to the local abbey, and a monk with steady hands and a quiet disposition would inscribe it for him. This was meant to be an occasional courtesy, not a career. But once nobles realised how convenient it was to have professional writers on call, the demand for scribes ballooned into something no monastery had prepared for. Scribes stopped being merely spiritual figures and became indispensable civic instruments. They copied laws, they copied deeds, they copied wills, they copied family trees. They copied genealogies so long and complex that whole afternoons could vanish trying to determine which cousin was legally allowed to inherit which turnip field. And, most importantly for the modern world, they copied books. Every single book in medieval Europe had to be reproduced by hand, letter by letter, page by page, by a very tired human being who had probably not slept properly in a decade. Scribal work was excruciating. Scribes spent entire days hunched over sloping desks in cold rooms, dipping quills into ink and forming letters with the concentration of a jeweller cutting diamonds. A single mistake could ruin a page, and ruining a page meant scraping the parchment down, sometimes destroying hours of previous work. Their eyes strained, their backs bent permanently, their fingers cramped into curled little claws by middle age. And still they kept working. Because a temporary literacy shortage had gradually turned into a permanent literacy industry. Monasteries began to compete over the quality of their scriptoria. Wealthy patrons ordered lavish illuminated manuscripts that took years to complete. Kings commissioned personal libraries. Universities, when they finally emerged, demanded copies of every important text, and the scribes obliged, muttering under their breath about how none of this was really their job to begin with. Some scribes, driven by exhaustion or mischief, left small notes in the margins of their manuscripts. Complaints about the cold, complaints about the ink, complaints about the noise from the kitchens, complaints about their fellow monks who snored, or ate too much, or persisted in singing off key during vespers. One famous marginal note simply reads, "Thank God it will soon be dark." Another says, "My hand is tired." A third laments, "New parchment, bad ink, oh I say nothing more." These little confessions, scratched onto the edges of otherwise sacred texts, are the closest we come to hearing the actual voices of medieval scribes. They were tired, they were bored, they were performing a temporary favour for humanity. And the favour never ended, and their descendants in profession only stopped when the printing press finally arrived to release them from their pens. The medieval seal was another temporary convenience that never quite retired. In the earliest days, seals were simple marks pressed into wax to confirm that a letter or document had come from a particular person. A knight might press his signet ring into a blob of wax to prove that a message was really from him. A merchant might use a seal to close a package so that any tampering would be visible. This was casual, personal, and very much of the moment. But once seals became associated with authenticity, they took on a life so grand and elaborate that seal-making eventually became its own profession. Kings had enormous ornate seals depicting themselves in full royal regalia, sometimes on horseback, sometimes seated on a throne with orb and sceptre. Bishops had seals showing themselves in prayer. Nobles had seals bearing their family arms, cities had seals depicting their patron saints, guilds had seals showing their tools. Even individual craftsmen developed seals to mark their goods as authentic, and once seals proliferated, a whole legal culture emerged around them. A document without a seal was suspect. A document with a wrong seal was worthless. A document with a seal that had been broken and reattached was a scandal in waiting. Forging seals became a serious crime, punishable by death in some jurisdictions, since forging a king's seal meant, in effect, forging the king himself. The wax used for seals was carefully coloured to indicate rank. Royal seals were often red. Ecclesiastical seals were often green. Ordinary seals were often plain. And the process of sealing a document became a ceremony in itself. Wax was warmed. The seal was pressed. A ribbon was often looped through the document and embedded in the wax, so that the seal could not be removed without visible damage. The whole affair was time-consuming, expensive, and utterly essential to medieval legal life. And even today, long after paper has replaced parchment and signatures have replaced seals for most purposes, seals still appear on the most solemn official documents. Diplomas, international treaties, presidential proclamations. Every time a modern government presses an embossed seal onto a piece of paper, it is unknowingly reenacting a medieval habit that was originally just a knight pressing his ring into wax to confirm he had really sent the letter. The medieval oven, of all things, is another beautiful example of the temporary becoming eternal. In many medieval villages, most households were far too small, too poor, or too structurally alarming to contain their own ovens. An oven required space, fuel, ventilation, and the sort of careful masonry that most peasant cottages could not accommodate. So villages built communal ovens, which were meant to be temporary shared solutions until more prosperous times allowed each family to build its own. This was, predictably, a very optimistic assumption. Communal ovens became the beating hearts of medieval bread culture, and no one ever managed to outgrow them. Every day, villagers would carry their raw dough to the communal oven, wait their turn, and bake their loaves together in the same shared space. The oven was often owned by the local lord, who charged a fee for its use. This fee, called a bannelet in France, was a small tax on bread baking, and it too was originally described as a temporary arrangement to help the lord recover the cost of building the oven. Naturally, the fee never went away. Generations of peasants paid the bread tax to lords who had long since recovered their initial investment. Some lords passed the oven and its accompanying tax down as an inheritance, and the villagers, having no realistic alternative, continued to bake their bread there and continued to pay for the privilege. The communal oven became more than a place of baking. It became a place of gossip. It became a place of matchmaking. It became a place where children were sent on errands and returned with more information than bread. It became a place where widows and widowers eyed one another across the flames and wondered whether the community might tolerate a second marriage. It became a place where feuds simmered, arguments resolved, and complaints about the weather flourished like weeds. What had been a practical, temporary arrangement became the social heart of the village. And in some parts of Europe, communal ovens continued to be used for centuries, even into the 20th century, long after private ovens were affordable and available. Because tradition, that stubborn medieval force, refused to loosen its grip on such warm and fragrant institutions. The medieval hospital was another accidentally eternal invention. In its earliest form, a hospital was not a place of medicine at all. It was a place of hospitality, hence the name. Monasteries and religious orders established these houses to shelter travellers, feed the poor, and care for the sick when no one else would. The idea was that a hospital would be a temporary refuge, a stop along a journey, a place of rest until a person either recovered, moved on, or peacefully departed for the next world. It was never intended to be a permanent medical institution, since medieval medicine, as practiced in most places, involved a combination of prayer, herbs, bloodletting, and hopeful expressions. But as populations grew, as cities expanded, and as diseases became increasingly creative in their choice of victims, hospitals became more and more necessary. They evolved from simple shelters into specialized institutions. Some cared for lepers, isolated from society but not entirely abandoned by it. Some cared for the elderly and the infirm. Some cared for pilgrims who had collapsed halfway through their journeys and could not reasonably be asked to complete them. Some cared for orphans, foundlings, and the mysteriously abandoned. Each hospital was founded, usually by a wealthy patron seeking heavenly credit, with the stated purpose of relieving a specific temporary need. And each hospital, without exception, kept operating long after that need had been forgotten. Some medieval hospitals still exist today, functioning under the same names, in the same buildings, on the same charitable charters that were written 800 years ago. A modern nurse walking through the halls of an ancient European hospital may be following the same corridors that medieval nuns walked while tending to plague victims. The temporary refuge became a permanent institution, and the institution became the ancestor of every modern hospital in the world. The medieval fair banner is another gentle example of the temporary quietly becoming eternal. When travelling merchants set up their stalls in a strange town, they needed some way to announce what they were selling, since most passers-by could not read a sign even if the merchant had bothered to write one. So merchants began hanging small painted cloths above their stalls, showing pictures of their wares. A cobbler hung a painted boot. A baker hung a painted loaf. A wine cellar hung a painted grape cluster. A blacksmith hung a painted horseshoe, which, being small and rectangular, tended to look more like a sad frown from a distance, but the customers understood. These painted cloths were meant to be temporary. A merchant would hang his banner during the fair, then take it down when the fair ended, then pack it into his cart and carry it to the next town. But once merchants began settling down and opening permanent shops in towns and cities, the temporary banners simply stayed hanging outside their doors. Painted images of boots, loaves, grapes, and cheerful little horseshoes swung gently in the wind above medieval shop entrances for centuries, becoming the ancestors of every modern shop sign, every logo, every trademark. The pub with a hanging sign showing a red lion or a golden fleece still swinging above the door of a modern English tavern is quite literally displaying a medieval fair banner that never got taken down. The temporary marker of a wandering merchant became the permanent identity of a business, and eventually became the entire concept of branding itself. Even the medieval habit of writing shop signs with pictures rather than words survived long after literacy became widespread. Modern signs still favour images. Modern logos still communicate visually. The reason has nothing to do with modern design theory and everything to do with a stubborn medieval habit of drawing a boot, because nobody in the crowd could read the word boot. The temporary illustration became a permanent visual language. And if a medieval peasant were somehow to stumble into a modern city, he would probably find himself completely lost, except when it came to shops, where he would confidently point at the painted images and say, with the calm certainty of 800 years of experience, yes, that one sells bread. That one sells shoes. That one sells wine. Nothing has changed. The medieval wardship, too, was a temporary arrangement that quietly built itself into a permanent legal institution. When a nobleman died leaving behind an underage heir, the child obviously could not manage the estate. So the crown or a senior lord would appoint a guardian, called a warden, to look after the child, the lands, and the income until the heir came of age. This was meant to be a purely practical, temporary arrangement. The warden would keep everything running smoothly, hand it over when the child grew up, and then politely retire from involvement. It was, on paper, a lovely little system of communal care. In practice, it became one of the most profitable rackets of the medieval world. Wardens realised very quickly that being placed in charge of a young heir's estate meant effectively having free access to the estate's income for years. Some wardens managed the estates responsibly. Others treated wardship as a personal windfall. They cut down the estate's forests for lumber. They squeezed extra taxes from the tenants. They arranged the ward's eventual marriage to whoever offered the largest fee, regardless of whether the marriage was suitable or even remotely tolerable. Some heirs came of age to discover that the estate they inherited had been stripped bare by the very person who was supposed to protect it. And yet the institution of wardship continued for centuries, evolving into a formal system with kings sometimes selling wardships to the highest bidder, which is quite possibly the most medieval sentence one could ever construct. A temporary act of guardianship had grown into a booming trade in orphans, treated less like children and more like properties bundled with income streams. The wardship system was so lucrative that it outlasted the feudal system itself. Some forms of it persisted into the 17th century, long after anyone remembered why it had been established in the first place. When it was finally abolished in England, the last generation of wardens howled about the loss of their traditional rights, as if managing other people's fortunes had been a divine inheritance rather than a bureaucratic accident. And even today, the concept of a guardian managing an inheritance for a minor child is a direct descendant of medieval wardship, cleaned up, formalised, and stripped of its more openly avaricious features, but still bearing the fingerprints of its ancestors. The medieval jury began as another temporary experiment that nobody quite got around to cancelling. In the earliest medieval trials, guilt was determined by ordeal. A person accused of a crime might be forced to hold a red-hot iron for a set number of steps, or to plunge his hand into boiling water, or to be tied up and thrown into a pond. If the wound healed cleanly, or if the person floated, or if they sank in a way considered spiritually appropriate, they were deemed innocent. If not, they were guilty. This system had many flaws, chief among them being the fact that it was completely mad. But it persisted for centuries because everyone assumed that God would ensure the correct outcome, and second-guessing God was frowned upon. Eventually, someone in England or somewhere nearby proposed a slightly more rational idea. What if instead of relying on divine judgment through ordeals, the accused were judged by a group of local men who knew the community, knew the situation, and could offer an opinion? This was originally a temporary alternative for cases where the ordeal seemed particularly ridiculous or inconvenient. Just a small group of neighbours offering informal testimony, nothing binding, nothing permanent. A helpful workaround for awkward situations. But the workaround proved so much more sensible than boiling water and hot irons that it gradually spread. First as an occasional option, then as a preferred method, then as the default. Trials by ordeal fell out of favour. Trials by jury took their place, and the small group of local men consulted informally grew into a formal body of jurors, with rights, duties and procedures. Over the centuries, this jury became one of the foundational institutions of legal systems across the world. A temporary workaround for occasionally impractical ordeals became the entire concept of trial by jury, still central to modern justice systems. Somewhere, the medieval villager who suggested that boiling water might not be the most reliable indicator of guilt is quietly amused. The medieval clerk began as a temporary assistant, hired to help important people manage the growing avalanche of documents that medieval life demanded. Kings needed clerks to draft letters. Bishops needed clerks to record ordinations. Merchants needed clerks to tally accounts. Nobles needed clerks to keep track of who owed them what, and, more importantly, who they owed to whom, since medieval debt could travel in surprising directions. Clerks were meant to be humble figures, invisible workers who did the actual writing while the important people took the credit and made the decisions. But clerks, being the only people in most medieval institutions who could actually read and write, quietly became indispensable. And the more indispensable they became, the more they began to accumulate influence. A king might sign a decree, but the clerk had drafted it. A bishop might make a proclamation, but the clerk had chosen the words. A merchant might close a deal, but the clerk had recorded the terms, and if the clerk chose to record them slightly differently than the merchant had negotiated, well, who was going to check? Clerks were the invisible authors of medieval civilization, and their quiet, methodical influence shaped laws, treaties, contracts, and eventually entire nations. What began as a temporary support role became the permanent skeleton of every bureaucracy. Some clerks rose to extraordinary power. In some kingdoms, the chief clerk of the royal chancery became one of the most influential figures in the realm, second only to the king himself. He controlled the flow of paperwork, he knew every secret, he drafted every decree, and when kings occasionally realized just how much power their clerks had accumulated, they usually tried and failed to reduce it. Because by then the clerks had made themselves too useful to remove, and their successors' successors continued to run the machinery of state long after every original clerk had died. The modern civil servant, the modern administrator, the modern middle manager, the modern bureaucrat, all descend from that first temporary clerk who was hired to help a lord answer a few letters and never went home. The medieval tally stick was yet another temporary invention that stayed for far too long. It was a simple concept. When two people wanted to record a transaction, they would take a wooden stick, carve notches into it representing the amount owed, then split the stick lengthwise. Each party would keep one half. When the debt was due, the two halves would be brought together and matched. If the notches aligned, the debt was proven. If they did not, someone had been tampering, and unpleasant conversations would follow. It was clever, portable, and completely resistant to forgery, since no two wooden grains split exactly the same way. Tally sticks were meant to be a temporary bookkeeping method until better systems arrived. Better systems did arrive, again and again. Paper, ink, ledgers, coins, banks, yet tally sticks refused to die. The English Exchequer used them for its official accounting for centuries, long after paper records had become widespread and reliable. Entire national debts were recorded on notched wooden sticks well into the modern era. In some cases, tally sticks were still legally recognised as valid financial instruments in Britain until 1826. And even then, the transition was so awkward that when the accumulated tally sticks were finally burned in 1834, the fire was so enormous that it accidentally set fire to the Houses of Parliament themselves, burning them to the ground. A temporary bookkeeping tool from the medieval world had, quite literally, destroyed the seat of modern government on its way out the door. Even in retirement, the medieval improvisation refused to go quietly. The medieval apprenticeship system was, at first, another one of those humble arrangements that nobody expected to codify into eternity. It began simply enough. A boy would show a talent for carpentry, or masonry, or weaving, or barrel making, and his parents, being medieval and therefore possessing very little use for a dreamy, unemployed child sitting around the cottage eating their bread, would arrange for him to live and work with a local master craftsman for a few years. The idea was practical. The boy would learn the trade, the master would gain a helper, and after some reasonable period, the boy would go off and set up his own workshop. Nobody imagined that this, small, temporary arrangement would balloon into one of the most rigid, elaborate, and deeply strange institutions of medieval Europe. Almost immediately, the system began to grow additional layers, as everything in medieval life eventually did. The reasonable period stretched from a couple of years into 7, sometimes 10, sometimes 12. The boy became not just a helper, but a semi-legal member of the master's household, sleeping in the workshop, eating at the master's table, wearing clothes the master provided, and generally being treated as a curious hybrid of family member, servant, and small unpaid stranger. Contracts were drawn up, fees were exchanged. The boy's parents paid the master for the privilege of having their son taught, and the master in turn promised to feed, clothe, and educate the boy in exchange for years of his labour. This was medieval higher education, and it involved considerably more sweeping of workshops than one might expect. The apprentice quickly discovered that most of his early years were spent doing tasks that had nothing to do with the craft he was theoretically learning. He fetched water, he carried heavy loads, he swept sawdust. He was sent to the market for supplies, and blamed if the supplies were inferior. He served ale to visitors. He watched the master's children when the master's wife needed a break. He held tools while the master worked, and if he accidentally handed over the wrong chisel, he was reminded of his mistake in a manner that ranged from mild scolding to to full theatrical outrage. Only very slowly, over years, was he permitted to touch the actual materials of the trade. And even then, his early attempts were often used as decorative kindling for the workshop fire, along with any lingering pride he might still possess. At the end of his apprenticeship, if he had endured all this and not run away to become a wandering minstrel, the young man became a journeyman. This word did not mean traveller, though it sounded like it should. It came from the French journe, meaning day, because journeymen were paid by the day rather than housed by the master. Journeymen were expected to travel from town to town, working under different masters, refining their skills, and eventually, if all went well, submitting a masterpiece to a guild for evaluation. If the masterpiece was accepted, the journeyman finally, at long last, became a master himself, allowed to open his own workshop and inflict this same system on the next generation of unfortunate boys. And so the cycle continued for centuries. Every skilled trade in Europe operated on this pattern. The temporary arrangement between a boy and a friendly craftsman had become an elaborate, multi-stage career track lasting decades. Even today, echoes of this system persist. Modern apprenticeships in trades, modern journeyman electricians and plumbers. The very words masterpiece, journeyman and master craftsman all descend directly from this medieval structure. When a modern culinary school describes a graduating chef's final dish as their masterpiece, they are unknowingly quoting the medieval guild system. When a modern electrician calls himself a journeyman, he is echoing a title that once meant a man being paid by the day and expected to travel with his tools rolled in a canvas bag. The temporary teaching arrangement between two households became the framework of professional education itself, and centuries later, we are all still shaped by it. The medieval dowry was another temporary arrangement that became a permanent expectation. In the earliest days, a dowry was simply a gift a bride's family gave to help the newlyweds establish their household. Some blankets, some pots, perhaps a chicken, perhaps a small cart, perhaps a modest sum of money to help pay for the first winter's supplies. It was a practical gesture of support, meant to ease the transition into married life. Nobody imagined it would grow into a competitive display of family wealth or a source of centuries-long financial catastrophe. But once dowries became expected, they became mandatory. Once they became mandatory, they became competitive. And once they became competitive, they became enormous. Families began ruining themselves financially to provide dowries impressive enough to secure suitable marriages for their daughters. In some regions, dowries grew so large that they consumed most of a family's wealth, forcing parents to save for decades, borrow against future harvests, or sell inherited lands just to marry off a single daughter. If a family had multiple daughters, the situation became genuinely catastrophic. Some fathers were known to refer to their daughters as beautiful and beloved and financially devastating, which was medieval humour at its most self-aware. The tragic irony was that once a dowry was paid, it did not really belong to the bride. It belonged to the husband, or, in some legal systems, to the husband's family. If the husband was wasteful, the dowry vanished within a few years. If the husband died, the dowry was often absorbed into his estate, rather than returned to the widow. Some widows found themselves impoverished after a marriage that had ruined their families to arrange. The dowry, meant as a temporary gift to launch a marriage, became a permanent expectation, a competitive burden, a source of family debt, and, in some regions, a lingering social custom that survived well into modern times. When modern families in certain cultures still exchange elaborate wedding gifts and financial arrangements, they are, whether they realise it or not, participating in the long shadow of a medieval custom that began as a friendly bundle of blankets and chickens. The medieval nunnery, too, is a fascinating example of the temporary becoming permanent. In its origins, a nunnery was often a small, informal community of women who had chosen a religious life, gathering together for prayer, study, and mutual support. Some were widows, some were unmarried women with no other place to go, some were noble women retreating from the pressures of court life, some were pious souls who had simply decided that they preferred prayer to marriage, which, given medieval marital arrangements, was often a very sensible preference. These communities were meant to be simple retreats, temporary shelters for devout women, run informally and often without much official oversight. Yet within a few generations, nunneries had become enormous, wealthy, formalised institutions with their own charters, their own lands, their own tenants, their own income streams, and their own political influence. Some medieval nunneries owned vast estates, some ran schools, some ran hospitals, some managed fisheries, vineyards, orchards, and dairies. Some produced their own beer, wine, cheese, and ink, all sold to raise funds for the community. Some copied books, some illuminated manuscripts, and some abbesses, the women in charge of nunneries, wielded political power comparable to that of male lords or bishops. There were medieval abbesses who commanded armies, presided over courts, and negotiated directly with kings, an astonishing level of authority in a world that otherwise offered women very few paths to influence. Nunneries also became, quite pragmatically, a kind of retirement community, a refuge, a boarding school, and a family safety net all rolled into one. A widow could enter a nunnery to live out her days in peace. A daughter with no dowry could enter and avoid the humiliation of remaining unmarried in her family home. A rebellious girl could be sent to one as a form of gentle exile. A brilliant scholar could enter and gain access to a library. A woman fleeing an abusive husband could sometimes find shelter behind convent walls. What had begun as a temporary retreat for devout women became one of the most enduring institutions of medieval life, providing options for women that the wider medieval world often refused to offer them. Many medieval nunneries lasted for centuries, sometimes for more than 1,000 years. Some were dissolved during the Reformation, some survived quietly through the modern era, and some still exist today, run by orders whose origins stretch back into the earliest medieval centuries. A modern nun praying in an ancient convent may be following a tradition first established by a small handful of women who simply wanted a quiet place to pray together and never imagined that their little community would still be praying, 13 centuries later, in the very same rooms. The medieval road toll was another temporary imposition that quietly cemented itself into legal permanence. When a lord repaired a road, or built a bridge, or improved a river crossing, he was permitted, temporarily, to charge a small fee to travellers who used it. The idea was simple. He had spent money. He should be allowed to recover the cost. Once the cost was recovered, the toll would end. This was, once again, a very optimistic assumption, because once a lord began collecting a toll, he discovered that tolls were remarkably profitable, and that any suggestion of ending them was met by his own household with looks of deep and personal betrayal. Toll booths sprang up along medieval roads with the enthusiasm of mushrooms after rain. Every lord whose land bordered a road demanded his own toll. Every bishop whose diocese contained a bridge demanded his own toll. Every town gate charged a small entry fee. Every ferry demanded a payment. A merchant travelling with a modest cart of goods might pay dozens of tolls in a single journey, each one nibbling away at his profit, until he arrived at his destination with less money than he had left home with. Complaints from merchants about tolls fill medieval records with the reliability of complaints about the weather, and both were regarded by authorities with equal indifference. Some medieval roads became so heavily tolled that they were barely worth travelling on. A merchant from northern Italy trying to bring goods to Flanders might cross dozens of small territories, each with its own toll station, each staffed by a board official who insisted on inspecting the cart, weighing the goods, and calculating the fee with the leisurely enthusiasm of a man being paid by the hour. By the time the merchant reached his destination, he had paid tolls to lords, bishops, abbeys, cities, ferries, bridges, and, in some particularly enterprising regions, individual peasants who had strung a rope across the road and declared themselves toll collectors on the theory that no one had specifically told them they could not. These self-appointed toll collectors were often removed by furious lords who resented the competition, though the peasants usually resumed operations a few weeks later a little further down the road. Toll stations became so numerous that in some parts of medieval Europe, a fully loaded barge floating down a major river might be stopped every few miles to pay yet another fee. The Rhine, in particular, became legendary for its tolls. By the late medieval period, more than 60 separate toll stations lined its banks, each demanding payment, each backed by the authority of some minor lord who had received the right to collect from a distant emperor centuries before. The temporary road repair fee had metastasized into a full economic parasite, and yet nobody could remove it, because every one of those tolls was legally protected by some ancient charter, some grandfathered privilege, some traditional right that had long since detached from any original justification. Even when kings tried to consolidate or eliminate tolls, the local lords resisted so fiercely that most reforms failed. The temporary road fee had become one of the most stubborn medieval institutions of all, and its descendants still exist today in the form of highway tolls, bridge fees, and river passage charges. Modern drivers grumbling at a toll booth on a highway are unknowingly participating in a medieval tradition that was originally supposed to pay for one man's bridge repair in the year 1148. The medieval carnival was another temporary release that quietly refused to be permanently released. In its origins, carnival was a brief seasonal indulgence, a few days of feasting and revelry before the long fasting of Lent. The idea was to consume all the rich foods, meats and dairy products that would soon be forbidden, and to have one last joyful eruption of noise before the church demanded quiet contemplation for 40 long days. Carnival was meant to be short, contained and clearly separated from ordinary life. It was a temporary window of chaos, blessed by tradition, tolerated by clergy, and cheerfully abused by everyone. But carnival, once permitted, expanded relentlessly. What began as 2 or 3 days of feasting stretched into a week, then 2 weeks, then, in some regions, the entire month of February. It became a season, a mood, a culture unto itself. Masks appeared, costumes appeared, parades appeared, music grew louder and more elaborate. Bonfires burned in city squares. Nobles disguised themselves as peasants. Peasants disguised themselves as nobles. Men dressed as women. Women, more discreetly, dressed as men. Children pelted grown adults with flour and eggs and pieces of hard bread, and grown adults, who during the rest of the year would have punished such behaviour, laughed and pelted them back. Order dissolved, but only within the carefully bounded space that carnival provided. It was chaos with a calendar, and the calendar, once written, could not easily be shortened. Church authorities occasionally tried to rein carnival in. They preached against its excesses, they condemned its immoralities. They wagged fingers about drunkenness, gluttony, and the unfortunate tendency of masked strangers to become mysteriously pregnant 9 months later. And every year carnival ignored the sermons and grew larger. The temporary release valve of pre-Lenten indulgence had become a permanent institution, a cultural touchstone, a communal ritual so deeply embedded in medieval life that not even the Reformation could fully abolish it in the regions where it had taken deepest root. Modern carnivals in Venice, in Cologne, in New Orleans, in Rio, all descend from the medieval habit of one last shout before the quiet. What was supposed to be a brief seasonal party became a permanent global tradition, and the party, in some form or another, has never truly ended. The medieval castle keep was itself, in many cases, meant to be a temporary structure. In the very earliest medieval fortifications, a lord might quickly throw up a wooden tower on a raised mound of earth, called a motte, surrounded by a rough wooden palisade. This was called a motte and bailey, and it was meant to be a fast, cheap, temporary defensive position, put up during a campaign or during the establishment of new territory. The idea was that once the region was secured and prosperity had returned, the wooden tower would be replaced with a proper stone one, and the temporary motte would be integrated into a permanent design. In some places, this actually happened. But in a surprising number of cases, the temporary wooden tower simply stayed there, rotting quietly, being patched and repaired and reinforced for generations. Some lords, faced with the prospect of tearing down a functional, if increasingly worm-eaten wooden keep to build a stone one, decided that the expense was unjustifiable. Their descendants inherited the same reasoning, and so wooden keeps that were supposed to last a decade ended up lasting a century or more, with each generation adding another layer of repair without ever committing to a proper rebuild. When they finally were replaced, it was often only because the wooden structure had collapsed on its own or burned down in a spectacular accident. The stone castles that eventually rose in their places were sometimes built on the exact same mounds using the exact same foundations, following the exact same layouts, because nobody could be bothered to reconsider a plan that had been settled 200 years earlier by a lord who had almost certainly meant it as a placeholder. Even the placement of medieval castles was often accidental. A lord fleeing from an enemy might have thrown up a hasty fortification on whatever hill he happened to reach before nightfall, intending to move to a better location once the danger had passed. But the temporary hill became the permanent castle site, and around it a village grew, and around the village a town, and around the town a small city, all clustered near a fortification that had been placed there for no better reason than one man's exhaustion on a particularly bad afternoon in the 11th century. Modern tourists admiring the picturesque location of a medieval castle are often unknowingly admiring the geographical consequences of a panicked improvisation from 1,000 years ago. The medieval calendar of saints was another temporary system that expanded far beyond its original scope. In the early medieval period, saints were rare. A saint was someone whose holiness had been recognized locally, whose life had been remembered by their community, whose feast day had been celebrated by the parish where they had lived and died. Sainthood was informal, and the list of saints was short enough that a well-educated priest could remember most of them without consulting notes. But as the medieval period progressed, saints multiplied with the enthusiasm of guilds and market days. Every village wanted its own saint. Every monastery promoted its founder's holiness. Every kingdom claimed a heavenly patron. Every profession lobbied for a saintly protector, so that shoemakers, brewers, laundresses, lepers, travellers, sailors, and even tax collectors could each have someone in heaven watching over them. The result was a calendar so packed with feast days that the practical difficulty of celebrating them all became a running joke among medieval priests. Some days had 3, 4, 5, even 6 saints assigned to them, each with their own liturgy, their own prayers, their own preferred hymns. Priests were forced to choose which saint to emphasize on any given morning, occasionally offending the followers of the neglected saints. Meanwhile, hopeful communities kept adding new saints to the calendar, canonizing local holy men and women whose lives had usually involved a great deal of prayer, a miracle or two, and, ideally, a dramatic death. The temporary act of recognizing an especially holy person had turned into an enormous, unmanageable, ever-growing catalogue of celestial personalities. Eventually, the Church tried to standardize the calendar of saints, reducing duplication, verifying miracles, and requiring formal canonization processes. But the medieval habit of local sainthood proved impossible to fully erase. Even today, small villages in Europe still celebrate obscure medieval saints whose feast days appear in no official calendar and whose lives are remembered only through fading local traditions. The temporary act of veneration became a permanent thread in the cultural fabric of countless communities, quietly persisting even in an age of skepticism and secular calendars. The medieval tithe was another temporary imposition that grew immortal. Originally, the tithe was a voluntary contribution to the church, given by devout Christians who wished to support their local parish. A tenth of one's harvest, or a tenth of one's income, offered freely as an act of piety. It was meant to be a personal decision, a spiritual gesture, an occasional gift. But medieval institutions, once they discovered a reliable source of income, could not bring themselves to allow it to remain voluntary. The tithe became expected, then required, then legally enforceable, then formally collected, then bitterly resented. Peasants who had once given tithes freely as an act of devotion found themselves being pursued by tithe collectors as if the payment were a tax, which functionally it now was. The tithe was collected in every conceivable form: grain, eggs, butter, chickens, wool, piglets, even fish in coastal regions. Special tithe barns were built to store the collected goods, and the ruins of some medieval tithe barns still stand across Europe, cavernous stone or timber structures that once held the accumulated wealth of the church in the form of everyone's produce. In some regions, the tithe expanded to include labour, requiring peasants to work a certain number of days each year on church lands. The temporary act of voluntary generosity had become a permanent institutional obligation, enforced by law and defended fiercely by clergy whose personal income depended on it. The tithe outlasted almost everything it had been born from. It survived the collapse of feudalism. It survived the Reformation, though in different forms in different countries. It survived plagues, famines, wars, and revolutions. In some parts of Europe, the tithe continued to be legally required well into the 19th century, long after the original spiritual meaning had been almost entirely forgotten. Farmers still handed over their tenth of the harvest, not out of piety, but out of habit, obligation, and the very medieval understanding that once something had been demanded for 1,000 years, it was easier to keep paying it than to fight it. The temporary spiritual gift had become a permanent economic institution, and when it finally was abolished, the abolition itself took decades of legislative wrangling, protests and negotiations, because tradition, as we have learned, does not go quietly. The medieval town wall was another temporary structure that quietly became eternal. Most walls began as urgent defensive measures during a specific crisis. A raid was imminent. A neighbouring lord was threatening war. A disease was spreading, and the townspeople wanted to control who entered. Whatever the trigger, walls were built quickly, often with whatever materials were at hand. Timber, rough stone, rammed earth, a hastily dug ditch. These first walls were understood by everyone to be temporary. Once the crisis passed, the walls would be dismantled, or reused, or allowed to collapse quietly. Except they never were. Once a town had walls, the townspeople discovered they liked having walls. Walls gave them a sense of safety, of identity, of being a proper place, rather than just a random cluster of buildings. Walls allowed them to control who entered and left, which allowed them to charge tolls, and, as we have already discussed, once medieval institutions began charging tolls. They never stopped. So the temporary walls stayed. They were repaired, they were expanded, they were rebuilt in stone, they were fitted with gates, towers, and defensive walkways. They became so integral to a town's identity that citizens took enormous pride in their walls, boasting about their thickness, their height, their number of gates, and the particular grandeur of their gatehouses. A town without walls was not really a town at all in the medieval mind. It was just an unfinished settlement waiting to be attacked. Over centuries, town walls became the physical shape of urban life. Cities grew, but not outward. They grew upward, packing more people and buildings into the same walled area, creating the tight, tangled, deeply atmospheric alleys that modern tourists find so charming today. Every twisted lane, every hidden courtyard, every impossibly narrow street in a medieval European city exists, because the walls forced the city inward. When walls were finally torn down in later centuries, they left behind ring roads, boulevards, and green belts, marking where they had once stood. If you look at an aerial map of many old European cities today, you can still trace the outline of vanished medieval walls in the shape of the surrounding streets. The temporary defensive structures shaped the geography of the modern city, and the city, in its bones, remembers them still. The medieval habit of urban gates was another accident that never faded. Gates were originally installed for defensive purposes, but they quickly became so much more than that. They were checkpoints where taxes were collected. They were customs houses where goods were inspected. They were social borders where the town's citizens could see and comment on who was entering and who was leaving. They were closed at night, symbolically separating the walled community from the wild darkness beyond. And they became so central to civic life that they gave rise to permanent professions. Gatekeepers, tax officers, inspectors, watchmen, whole families made their livings from these positions, and the positions passed from generation to generation with the same tenacity that clung to every other medieval office. Even when walls became militarily obsolete, gates lingered, because tearing them down felt like tearing down the town itself. Some medieval gates still stand today in cities across Europe, no longer defensive, no longer taxed, no longer closed at night, but standing quietly at the ends of their streets, like the ghosts of the temporary they once were. The medieval marketplace was another temporary space that became permanent. In early villages, markets were simply held wherever there was room. An empty field, a church courtyard, a patch of ground near the well. As commerce grew, however, communities began to designate specific spaces for their markets, and these spaces became sacred to the town's identity. The market square, the market cross, the market gate. Around these gathering places, medieval life organised itself with an intensity that outlived every institution that surrounded them. Buildings grew up around market squares. Town halls were built overlooking them, churches were built beside them, guild halls faced them. And the square itself, though it began as a temporary open space for stalls, became the permanent centre of the community. Modern European cities still preserve their medieval market squares with something approaching reverence. Tourists gather there, weddings are photographed there, public events, festivals and demonstrations still take place there, and on certain days of the week in many of these squares a market still returns, complete with stalls, umbrellas and merchants shouting cheerfully about their vegetables. What began as a temporary place to sell turnips became the permanent heart of urban culture, and the heart, remarkably, is still beating. The medieval habit of naming streets after professions is another lingering echo of temporary practicality. Streets were originally named for whatever activity happened on them. Baker Street was the street where bakers worked. Shoe Lane was the street where cobblers gathered. Fish Street sold fish. Wool Lane sold wool. Ironmonger Street sold iron. This was simple, practical, and entirely accurate at the time it was decided. But once professions moved, spread out, or died out, the names stayed. Modern Baker Street in London has not had a functioning bakery on it in living memory, but the name remains, quietly commemorating a medieval commercial arrangement that hasn't existed for centuries. Cities across Europe are filled with street names describing crafts and trades that vanished long ago. And yet every time we say the name, we are echoing a temporary organisational decision from the 12th century that nobody ever thought to update. Even more curious are the streets named after events, individuals or medieval oddities that no living person remembers. Grope Lane, which in various European cities was often the street where prostitutes worked, has been carefully renamed over the centuries by modest civic authorities into things like Grape Lane or Grove Lane, an attempt to gently sanitise a medieval label that had begun as a very direct description of local commerce. Some streets are named after miracles that supposedly happened there. Some are named after saints who had already been forgotten by the time the sign was carved. Some are named after long-dead lords whose descendants have vanished entirely. And every time we walk down these streets, we are walking through the temporary decisions of medieval townspeople who never expected their casual practical names to become the identity of streets for the next 1,000 years. The medieval quill was itself a temporary tool. Feathers from geese, swans, or occasionally more exotic birds were sharpened into writing instruments as a stopgap solution to the problem of needing to write things down. Nobody imagined that goose feathers would become the standard writing tool of European civilization for over 1,000 years. But once the technique of preparing quills was mastered, once ink had been perfected, once parchment had become widespread, the quill embedded itself into the practice of writing so deeply that it dominated the profession until the invention of the metal nib in the 19th century. Every medieval document, every royal decree, every religious manuscript, every love letter, every complaint, every accusation, every sermon was written with a goose feather. Somewhere a medieval goose looks at the historical record with the profound realization that its cousins were the true authors of civilization. The medieval bell tower was another temporary religious tool that grew far beyond its original purpose. Bells were installed in churches initially to call the faithful to prayer at set times of the day. That was the entire idea. But once the bells rang out over the town, they began to be used for everything else. Warning bells for fires, alarm bells for approaching enemies, curfew bells to signal the end of the day, passing bells to announce a death, wedding bells, baptism bells, festival bells, storm bells to warn of incoming weather, bells to announce the arrival of the mail, bells to celebrate the harvest, bells to summon meetings of the town council, bells to declare that beer was available at the tavern, which was arguably the most attended of all bell-related events. The medieval world lived by the rhythm of bells, and the bells, once installed, rang for centuries, becoming the audible clock, calendar, alarm system, and public address system of every community that could afford them. Even the medieval habit of writing dates using saints' feast days rather than numerical dates is a lingering echo of temporary practicality. Medieval documents often specify events as happening on the Feast of St. Michael, or the eve of the Feast of St. Martin, or the day after the Feast of the Purification of the Virgin. This was simply how medieval people organised time. The saint's calendar was more familiar to most people than a numerical calendar, so it made practical sense to use it. But once this system was in place, it persisted for centuries, even in official legal and financial documents, until well into the modern era. Some traditional agricultural rents in parts of Britain are still calculated by reference to feast days like Michaelmas and Lady Day, medieval anchors that continue to structure modern financial arrangements. The temporary habit of dating things by saints has become a fossilised feature of certain legal traditions, quietly persisting long after the reason for it has faded. The medieval habit of oaths of fealty, of homage, of loyalty, of service, all created temporary bonds that solidified into permanent structures. Every knight owed loyalty to a lord, who owed loyalty to a greater lord, who owed loyalty to a king who theoretically owed loyalty to an emperor, or a pope, or God himself. Each link in this chain was originally personal, a promise between two men, meant to last only as long as both lived. But once the chain was established, it was inherited. Sons inherited their father's loyalties, grandsons inherited their grandfather's oaths. And so the temporary personal bond between two medieval men became the permanent structural relationship between entire families, entire regions, entire kingdoms. Loyalty became a form of inheritance, no different from land or livestock. A boy born into a knightly family found himself, at the age of reason, already committed to a lord he had never met, in a chain of allegiance forged by ancestors he had never known. Wars were fought over these inherited bonds. Marriages were arranged to strengthen them. Feuds were carried across centuries because of them. The medieval world was, in many ways, a vast web of temporary promises that had accidentally hardened into the skeleton of European civilization. And when feudalism finally faded, its residue lingered in aristocratic titles, hereditary offices, and the peculiar habit of certain noble families to still describe themselves in terms of loyalties owed to sovereigns whose kingdoms have not existed for hundreds of years. The medieval habit of using Latin for official documents was another temporary decision that outlasted its usefulness by nearly 1,000 years. In the earliest medieval period, Latin was the language of the church, of scholarship, of the surviving remnants of the Roman world. It made practical sense to use Latin for important documents, because Latin was the one written language that scholars across Europe could all read. It was meant to be a temporary common tongue, useful until vernacular languages developed enough written traditions to take over. Except vernacular languages developed rapidly, and Latin remained the language of law, medicine, science, and religion long after everyone had stopped speaking it in daily life. Medieval peasants who could not read a single word of Latin were nonetheless subject to laws written in Latin, taxed by documents written in Latin, married by ceremonies conducted in Latin, and buried with prayers spoken in Latin. Their entire lives were framed by a language they did not understand, administered by a small literate class who understood it perfectly and did not always feel motivated to translate. This was, in some ways, a wonderfully convenient arrangement for the literate class, since a peasant who could not read his own contract could not easily argue that the contract said something different than the collector claimed. The temporary use of Latin as a shared scholarly language became a permanent barrier between the educated and everyone else, and it took centuries of reform, translation, and popular pressure to gradually dismantle it. Even today, Latin persists in ceremonies, mottos, legal phrases, and the scientific names of every plant and animal on Earth. A medieval scholar visiting a modern university would find much unfamiliar, but he would recognize the Latin instantly and would probably feel deeply reassured that at least some things had refused to change. The medieval habit of celebrating the new year on different dates in different regions was itself a temporary arrangement that lasted embarrassingly long. In some parts of medieval Europe, the year began in January. In others, it began in March. In others, at Easter. In others, at Christmas. In others, on the Feast of the Annunciation on the 25th of March. Every region insisted its date was the correct one, and no one was in a particular hurry to standardize. This was meant to be a temporary regional variation, but it lasted for centuries, causing enormous confusion for anyone trying to date events across borders. A letter written in one country on the 10th of March in one year might arrive in another country to be filed under the previous year, because the calendars had not yet agreed on when the year began. It took until the 16th and 17th centuries for Europe to finally agree on the 1st of January as the start of the year, and even then, some regions dragged their feet for another 100 years. Because tradition, as we have observed so many times tonight, does not enjoy being asked to change its mind. The medieval habit of measuring things by local units also lingered far past its usefulness. Every region had its own units of length. Every town had its own weights. Every valley had its own volume measurements. A pound in one town was not a pound in the next. A yard here was not a yard there. Merchants travelling across medieval Europe carried little books full of conversion tables, patiently calculating how many local ounces made up a foreign pound, how many local feet equalled a foreign yard, how many local cups filled a foreign gallon. This was chaos, but it was familiar chaos, and every attempt to standardize measures across regions was met with fierce local resistance. Peasants believed their local pound was correct, and every other pound was suspicious. Merchants profited from the confusion. Lords protected their local standards because the standards were tied to local revenues. It took the French Revolution, of all things, to finally push Europe towards standard measurements with the introduction of the metric system, and even then adoption was slow, painful, and resisted in many places. Britain famously held on to its medieval measures for centuries longer, and even today uses miles, pounds, and gallons in defiance of international standardization. Every time a modern British driver checks their speed in miles per hour, they are participating in a medieval habit of local measurement that quietly outlived kings, empires, and even the concept of a unified Europe. The temporary local units became permanent identities, and identities, as we have learned again and again tonight, are the hardest things of all to persuade a community to give up. The medieval habit of family crests, coats of arms, and heraldic symbols began as a very temporary battlefield practicality. When knights covered themselves in armour, their faces vanished behind helmets, and it became genuinely difficult to tell one armoured figure from another, so each knight painted a distinctive symbol on his shield: a lion, a cross, a star, a tree, a stag, a double-headed eagle looking mildly angry in both directions at once. This was meant to be a simple recognition system for the battlefield, nothing more. But once the symbol was chosen and used a few times, the knight's family became attached to it, and the symbol became hereditary. Sons carried their father's coats of arms. Daughters, upon marrying, sometimes combined their family arms with those of their husbands, creating increasingly elaborate designs that told the family's whole history in a single shield. Within a couple of generations, heraldry had exploded into a full-blown discipline, with its own vocabulary, its own rules, its own dedicated experts called heralds, who could recite the arms of thousands of families and could argue passionately about the correct depiction of a rampant lion versus a passant lion versus a couchant lion, distinctions invisible to nearly everyone else. Coats of arms began to appear not just on shields, but on banners, on cloaks, on tableware, on doors, on gravestones, on furniture, on jewellery, and on any surface that would hold paint or engraving. Entire manuscripts were produced simply to catalogue the coats of arms of the nobility. Cases were fought in medieval courts over the right to use certain symbols. Wars, occasionally, were sparked by heraldic disputes. And modern institutions still use coats of arms today. Universities, cities, countries, sports clubs. Companies, every logo, every emblem, every insignia carries in its dinar the memory of a knight who once painted a lion on his shield so that his companions could tell him apart in the chaos of battle. A temporary battlefield identifier became one of the most durable symbolic systems in human history. And now, as our journey through the medieval world begins to wind down, we come to perhaps the most sweeping observation of all. Nearly everything about medieval Europe was supposed to be temporary. The bells, the wells, the fences, the tolls, the tithes, the oaths, the apprenticeships, the dowries, the nunneries, the saints, the scribes, the seals, the market days, the tally sticks, the town walls, the gates, the town names, the professions, the measurements, the Latin, the coats of arms, the clocks, the pilgrimages, the tournaments, the charters, the guilds, the inns, the clerks, the wardships, the juries, the carnivals, the castle keeps, the bridges with houses on them, the muddy roads that never got fixed, the feast days that filled the calendar, the fair courts, the sumptuary laws about pointed shoes, the seal wax colours, the communal ovens, the hospital charters, the village patterns, the bell towers, the pilgrim badges, the heraldic lions rampant, the straw on tavern floors, the chickens indoors during winter, the nicknames that became surnames, the temporary settlements that became cities. None of it was meant to last. Every single one of these institutions, habits and customs began as a quick solution to an immediate problem. Someone was tired, or cold, or scared, or hungry, or under attack, or simply tired of walking too far to fetch water. And they improvised. They threw up a wall, dug a hole, hung a banner, promised loyalty, painted a lion, rang a bell. And each of those improvisations, expected to be replaced or forgotten within months or years, instead settled quietly into the bedrock of European civilization, where they remained for centuries, sometimes for 1,000 years, sometimes down to the present day. The medieval world was not really a world of grand plans and mighty designs. It was a world of accidents, of improvisations, of desperate solutions and lazy postponements, of temporary fixes that refused to be temporary. And when we look at the modern world, when we drive down a curving highway that follows an ancient property line, when we swear an oath in a courtroom, when we listen to a church bell in the evening, when we admire an old European city with its walled centre and twisted lanes, when we sign a legal document that still requires an official seal, when we celebrate a carnival before a religious fast, when we walk down Baker Street or Fish Lane or Weaver's Row, we are surrounded by the ghosts of medieval improvisations. The world we live in was built by people who never intended to build it. They were just trying to get through the day. And their temporary solutions, layered one atop another, became the very floor beneath our feet. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the room grows quiet around you, remember this. Nothing in the medieval world was ever really finished. Everything was just left, gently, quietly, for someone else to deal with later. And later, apparently, is now. Sleep well, dear listener. The bells are still ringing, the walls are still standing, and the medieval world, in 1,000 quiet ways, has never truly ended. Thank you so much for spending this evening with me. If you enjoyed our journey, please do leave a kind comment, share where you are listening from, and consider subscribing so that we can continue exploring these strange and beautiful corners of history together. Good night, sleep deeply, and rest well. Peace.